schools where there's no food on the table many nights of the week. That's Ubuntu. That's the sense of showing compassion and caring for the rest of our communities. And that's the kind of contribution that we could easily make. But when economic policies that prescribes those cuts, the cuts in the tax to GDP ratio is made, we applaud the tax cuts that the wealthy get every year, and we say what a marvelous finance minister Trevor Manuel is. But the consequence of that is that poorer communities are getting poorer because there's less money in the public purse to address their urgent issues. So the choices that we make and the choices that we applaud, and even the silence when we think that those issues don't affect us directly, will come back to haunt us, and that's what we've got to respond to. And so I want to argue that we've got to find a way to choose the higher road again, to call our country to a consensus on what it is that we want to do into the future, and to make sure that we appreciate that democracy in South Africa can't be about giving black people the vote every 5 years. It will mean nothing to people if it's not accompanied by addressing the desperate circumstances that they live in. And the way in which we do that can be as an outcome of a conversation that we have amongst each other. But we've got to appreciate that that's something we've got to apply ourselves to, and that's something that we must respond to differently. I want to agree with the points that were made earlier, that there's no doubt that we've got to go with the economy. We've got to go with the enterprises that exist. We've got to create new enterprises, and we've got to go with the possibilities that exist in our country. There's no disagreement about that. The question is, how do we do it, and what commitment do we demonstrate to take that forward? And there's really a time in our country now when we've got to talk about a new deal. A new deal that's part of what we do at the macroeconomic level. What are we saying is the tax to GDP ratio? What are we going to do about fiscal and monetary policy? And how are those things going to impact on the special measures that government's trying to put in place? Those measures should be welcomed because what they do is they appreciate for the first time that there's a fundamental problem in South Africa around the levels of unemployment. And the President's State of the Nation address prioritizes unemployment as the main things that we must respond to. And so the new growth path emerges out of that context. And the new growth path talks about what are the kind of measures that we can put in place to support existing industry, to promote the setting up of new industry, to defending the jobs that we have, and to creating new job opportunities for our people. And so there's a variety of measures. Some of the tax cuts and other support measures were earlier announced. And I want to touch on just a few of them very quickly, because that was the key part of what I was asked to reflect on today. The first one probably goes to the questions of saving and investments. Government's put aside a lot of money to make sure that there's capital available for enterprises and that there's support for different businesses at a variety of levels. So the IDC, the Development Bank of South Africa, the different financial houses that come on board and make commitments to fund that, as well as the job funds that government has put in place. We've got to make sure that entrepreneurs are able to access those funds that are available and that it's accessible to a broader section of the society. We've got to make sure that more businesses are set up and that the response to that is an important outcome of what the measures are that we put in place, whether it's entrepreneurial development or skills development or encouraging children to start businesses instead of looking for a job where they're going to be employed. But there's also the question that we've got to attend to around investments and savings in South Africa. We have a low level of saving in South Africa, and partly because the majority of the citizens can barely make ends meet every week, so there's not money to set aside for savings. But there are significant amounts of money in pension funds, in provident funds, and in other forms of savings. We've got to decide on a commitment to invest at least a part of that funds into socially desirable projects, even if the government has to underwrite the returns on those investments. If they could do it under a project with prescribed investments to advance, and most of that money was invested in the Defence Force then, why can't we do it now by saying 5% could be prescribed investment, and that should be invested in the areas that respond to the key challenges within our society? That's a decision we've got to take. And a lot of the finance houses must be thinking, even if the return on the investment is a percentage or two lower, isn't it a worthwhile reduction in the short-term returns, but a longer-term investment? And that's the challenge that we must all take account of. We've got to take a longer-term view of the society by making sacrifices in the short term, but guaranteeing that there's going to be a long-term opportunity and an outcome for all of us. Then we've got to look at questions of public procurement and local procurement within the South African economy. Government's putting in place new legislation that will force local, provincial, national governments to buy South African, that forces the parastatals, Eskom, Transnet, SAA and all of the others to ensure that they buy from South African companies first. That's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to set up businesses to service those needs. So instead of having one black guy putting up a company where he imports the products from China, we want to make sure that that black guy or white guy or whatever color he may be is employing people to make those products in South Africa. That's not only important in taking up the job needs in the short term, but it re-establishes the industrial capacity of our society. And along with that must go a number of other measures, but that's an important indicator of how proudly South African we can be. That means that when you go into a store, though, you've got to look at the label of origin inside the clothes and try and find a product that is in your fashion line that's made by a South African worker rather than an imported product. Because you know that in the clothing industry, most of the women who work there are single moms in the Cape Flats. So that's an important contribution to sustaining livelihoods, and that should be something that we all have an interest in. So I would argue that the things are intimately related. What we want to do about changing the desperate circumstances in communities can be directly linked